God Adventurer, Chapter 4. Too Far to Walk. Hudson's first reaction to the doctor's startling pronouncement was one of sorrow and disappointment. If he were dying, that meant he could not go to China. China! How he had longed to go there! How deep had been his conviction that God had a work for him in that land! It seemed impossible that he had been mistaken about it all. Had he been mistaken? If God really intended him to go to China, thought Hudson, then he must get better in spite of this doctor's assertion that there was no hope. This he tried to explain. He was not afraid to die, he pointed out. The prospect of being with his master, whom he was learning to love very much, was a very inviting one. However, he was sure he had a work to do for him in China first, and therefore he must be pulled through this illness. That's all very well, the doctor replied impatiently. This was no time for the young student to reason why he should live, when it was evident he was going to die. You get home as fast as you can. You've no time to lose. You'll soon be quite incapable of winding up your affairs. It was hardly a cheerful motive for hurrying, and anyway, he had not enough money to pay the fare for the 4-mile ride to Soho. Hudson smiled a little wryly to himself as he departed. He dragged himself slowly along the road to the place where he could get on an old horse-drawn omnibus and wearily climbed into it, conscious of the pain in his arm as the clumsy vehicle rumbled and bumbled along the streets. When he finally reached his lodging and climbed up the 3 flights of stairs to his attic, he was exhausted. Hoping, however, to do anything that might save his life, he cut his own finger open to let out some of the poison. The pain was intense, but that was the last thing he remembered. He fell unconscious to the floor. For some weeks, Hudson lay in his bed, too weak to move from the room. When he had been found in a dead faint on the floor, an artist uncle of his who lived nearby had been called, and this kind man had taken charge for him. Sending immediately for a doctor, and despite Hudson's protests that he could not afford to pay the bill, "He is my own medical man, and the bill will be sent to me," he said reassuringly. "Don't worry over that." When the doctor arrived and heard Hudson's story, he looked grave. "Well," he said frankly, "if you've been living moderately, you may pull through. But if you've been going in for alcohol and that sort of thing, I'm afraid there's no hope." With vivid memories of apples and brown bread washed down by cold water, Hudson was able to reassure him if recovery depended on living simply, he knew of no one who stood a better chance. "But now," said the doctor, "it's going to be a hard struggle. You must do everything possible to keep up your strength. A bottle of port wine every day, and as many chops as you can eat," he told Hudson's uncle. That sort of diet did not appeal to Hudson, but he did his best with it. After many days and nights of suffering, he was at last able to move out of his room and lie for an hour or 2 on a sofa in the boarding house lounge. It was not until then that he learned that 2 other medical students who had become infected about the same time as he were both dead. Why had his life then been saved? He felt it could be for no other purpose than that there was a work for him to do in China. One day when the doctor came after expressing satisfaction at the progress made by his patient, he said, "The best thing you can do now is to get off to the country as soon as you feel fit to make the journey. You must rest until you've gained more strength. If you start work too soon, the result may still be serious." When he had gone, Hudson lay back on the sofa to review his position. Get off to the country? His thoughts flew to the cosy, happy home in Yorkshire. The Cudworth Road, along with which he had raced so often as a child, merrily bowling his hoop and teasing Amelia as she came trotting breathlessly behind, corkscrew curls bouncing. The shady glades of the Lun Woods where butterflies fluttered and birds' nests could be found. The distant view of the Pennines. Get off to the country. The doctor's orders were wholly attractive and commended itself to him in every way. Hudson realised that he was still far too weak to attempt this strenuous life in the hospital yet, and obviously there was nowhere he could regain his health so quickly as in his own home. There was only one obstacle in the way. He had no money at all for the fare. Actually, he well knew the money could be obtained with the utmost ease, just for the asking. His kind uncle would be more than willing to lend it. If he were to drop the smallest hint in a letter home, his fare and more would arrive by post. Yet as he lay on the sofa, exhausted as he was after the effort of walking down the stairs, there was something in him that refused to consider taking the easy and obvious course. He still wanted to try out this method of getting used to relying on God to answer his prayers, instead of depending on those who would not be present to help him in China. He closed his eyes as he lay there, and explaining this to God, asked him what he should do. After this prayer, he remained quiet for a while, thinking over the matter. If he had not forwarded that money to Mrs. Finch, he thought, he would have had enough. If only Finch had not chosen to depart his ship of that particular time, Hudson would have been able to draw the money. Then the thought came that perhaps if he went to the shipping office, he might even yet be able to draw it. It seemed unlikely, since he had forwarded the remittance to Mrs. Finch entirely on his own responsibility. The thought persisted. Was God putting it into his mind, he wondered, or was it just a silly idea of his own? He was not sure. He closed his eyes again and prayed, asking God which it was. If the idea did come from God, the fact remained that the shipping office was 2 miles away and he had no money for a ride there. To walk, in his condition, was out of the question. It had been necessary for someone to help him even walk down the stairs. Yes, to walk was out of the question, but was it? Was it? To his own surprise, Hudson found himself thinking that perhaps it was not out of the question after all. God had already done some remarkable and unexpected things after he had prayed. Jesus Christ had said, "Whatsoever you shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son." Jesus had said it 1800 years before, but as Hudson lay in the boarding house sofa, it all seemed suddenly real and very up to date. There was something very convincing about the calm assertion, "Whatever you ask in my name, I will do it." In view of it, to walk to the shipping office in Cheapside no longer seemed out of the question. Obviously, all that was necessary was to ask to be strengthened to do it. So that is what Hudson did. Then he rang for the boarding house servant and asked her to go up and fetch his hat and stick. Once that respectful but somewhat surprised young lady handed them to him, he slowly emerged from the house, then turned along the quiet street into the busy thoroughfare leading towards the city. His progress, admittedly, was slow. He showed an unusual interest in the contents of shop windows, pausing at almost every other one to lean against the glass. Ladies in crinolines swept past him as he continued his deliberately leisurely pace. Street vendors called to him in vain to buy their goods. He did not so much as turn his head to watch an elegant coach with briskly trotting horses come smartly along the street. If the young Queen Victoria herself had driven past, he would not have roused himself to look. But gradually he was making the journey. He had asked for strength to walk it. He reminded himself as he faced the sharp incline that led to Cheapside, and strength would surely be given. Walk it he did. He arrived safely at the shipping offices and sat down on the steps before attempting to climb the stairs up to the first floor. It was a little unusual, he realised, to take a seat just there. The top-hatted gentleman who hurried past him up and down the stairs evidently thought so too. They eyed him with some surprise, as though thinking, "Tut, tut, quite a respectable-looking fellow too." However, no one spoke to him, and eventually he reached the top and entered the office. This was the crucial moment that brought him to his place. After all the exertion of the 2-mile walk, was he to be met with a disappointment? Somehow Hudson felt it was going to be all right. And it was. The clerk who greeted him recognised him immediately. "Oh, I am so glad you have come," he exclaimed. "It turns out that after all it was not the mate Finch who ran away, but an able seaman of the same name. I shall be glad to give you the half pay due to Mrs. Finch up to date. It will no doubt reach her more safely through you than through her husband. His ship has just reached Gravesend, and we all know the temptations these men meet when they come ashore after a voyage." He looked keenly at the young medical student standing so pale and obviously weak. "Before I give you the money," he continued, "you must have a rest and something to eat. I'm just going to have my lunch. You must come inside and share it with me." Gratefully, Hudson accepted the kind invitation, and he was glad of the opportunity to rest and eat. He made his journey back to Soho in an omnibus, since he could afford it now. The effort he had made seemed to have done him good rather than harm. The next morning he felt so much better that he had no hesitation about going round to the doctor's surgery to settle his bill. His uncle had already done so much for him, but Hudson was unwilling to leave him to pay for it and then spend his own money on railway fares to go home for a holiday. He realised that by paying the doctor's bill himself meant he would be left with insufficient money to buy his ticket. It seemed the only honourable thing to do. So off he went to the doctor, and there a further pleasant surprise awaited him. The doctor refused to charge him anything. "You're a young medical student," he said firmly. "As such, I shall charge you nothing for my services." "But medicines," Hudson argued. All that quinine, I ought to pay for that." "Very well," said the doctor. "Quinine. You can pay for the quinine, and that's all." Hudson made a rapid mental calculation as he handed over the surprisingly small sum. When his bills were paid, there would be enough left for his railway fare to Yorkshire, the omnibus journey to his home, and the necessary food for the journey. He was overjoyed. This was wonderful. At every step, he found his affairs were planned out to what seemed perfection. He simply could not keep it all to himself. This amazing evidence that God was fully prepared to take responsibility for the ordering of his life. If God did this for him, he most certainly would for others too. The doctor must be told. "Pardon me, sir," he said respectfully. "I wonder if you will allow me to speak to you freely without being offended. I feel that under God I owe my life to your care and attention, and I am truly grateful. There is something I want to tell you about." He related the whole story of his reason for being in London, his intention to find out if God really answered prayer before he went to China, and the things he had experienced in doing so. The surgeon listened with kind, though sceptical interest until Hudson told him of his walk to Cheapside the previous day. The doctor could not believe that. "Impossible," he exclaimed. "Why, I left you lying on that sofa looking more like a ghost than a man." "I did walk it, indeed, sir," asserted Hudson, explaining that he had prayed in the name of Jesus to be strengthened to do it before walking out. "Do you mean you walked? You did not even go by omnibus?" "No, I walked." "All the way from Soho to Farringdon Street, and then up to Snow Hill to Cheapside?" "Yes, sir." The doctor was interested now. It seemed incredible that one who had been so weakened by illness could take a 2-mile walk alone through London's busy streets and be none the worse for it. He listened to the recital of the happy outcome of the walk, in the money received, how Hudson had been able to settle all his bills, and last of all, that after the price of quinine was paid, he had just enough to see him home. There was a restrained yet evident joy about the convincing way Hudson told his story that touched the older man's heart. This practical confidence in a God who, after all, could neither be seen nor heard, was something new to him. Tears welled up slowly in his eyes as he looked at the strangely radiant expression of the open-faced boy before him. He said in a voice deepened by emotion, "I'd give all the world for a faith like yours." "You can have it, you know, sir," answered Hudson quietly. "It's free to all, without money and without price."